On the 25th of October, 1944, the most powerful gunnery fleet in history turned around and sailed away from a target that could barely fight back. This morning begins far from any admiral's bridge, on the wet deck of a destroyer that is about to do something no one expects of her. The men of the Johnston stand the early watch in warm, sticky air, the deck rolling under their boots on the long Pacific swell, the whole ship smelling of fuel oil, salt water, and cold coffee. Somewhere in the gray before dawn, over the island of Samar, aircraft climb into the sky on an ordinary morning patrol. The men on the Johnston know the Japanese fleet has been beaten somewhere and is falling back. Within minutes, they will learn how badly they were wrong. Because 20-odd miles to the north, on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, stands a man who is about to be wrong on a far greater scale. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita has slept almost none of the past 2 days. 2 days earlier, his first flagship, the heavy cruiser Atago, sank beneath him, and Kurita swam in the warm water until a destroyer pulled him out. He still commands the most powerful ship on the planet, and around her 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and a screen of destroyers. The 9 guns of the Yamato measure 46 centimeters across, the largest naval guns ever sent to sea, and they throw shells weighing more than 1.5 tons across 26 miles of ocean. On the horizon, foreign masts rise into view. Kurita looks at them and sees the American Third Fleet. Fast fleet carriers of the Essex type, battleships in escort, heavy cruisers. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Tomiji Koyanagi, would later describe that minute this way: 4 or 5 large carriers guarded by a battleship or 2, and perhaps 10 heavy cruisers. A dream fleet, delivered to the strongest formation of the Imperial Navy, right under its guns. The count was wrong by exactly 5 times over. What stood on that horizon was not the Third Fleet. It was 6 slow escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, gathered under the codename Taffy Three. Landing support ships whose only task that morning was to fly cover for the beachhead and hunt for submarines. Not one gun in the whole formation was larger than 5 inches. The fastest ship among them could barely make 18 knots, where the Japanese cruisers ran at better than 30. And between that handful of ships and the defenseless troop transports in Leyte Gulf, there was now nothing at all. Kurita did not know this. He saw a threat on the horizon, not a prize. And that single difference would decide the next 3 hours. To understand how an all-seeing fleet could go so blind, it helps to go back a few days, to what this fleet was built from and what it believed. Kurita's formation was called the Center Force. It was built around the 2 largest warships ever constructed, the Yamato and the Musashi, each displacing about 68,000 tons. A fleet of the battleship age in its purest form, a weapon made for one particular battle the Japanese admirals had dreamed of for decades. A decisive clash of the battle lines, where heavy guns win the war in a single afternoon. The whole of Japanese naval doctrine, all of its training, all of its faith, had been built around a gunnery duel of giants. There was one problem. By October of 1944, that war was already over, and it had not ended in favor of the guns. The Center Force was steaming toward Leyte Gulf under the plan of Operation Shogo, the last great attempt by the Imperial Navy to turn the war around. The scheme was intricate and desperate. Far to the north, Admiral Ozawa led a force of carriers with almost empty decks, cast in a single roll, as bait. He was meant to draw off the powerful American Third Fleet of Admiral William Halsey to pull it away from the beachhead. If the bait worked, 3 other Japanese forces would slip through the central Philippines and fall on the landings from 3 sides. The bait worked completely. Halsey swallowed it and took north with him 5 fleet carriers, 5 light carriers, 6 fast battleships, 8 cruisers, and more than 40 destroyers. Over 600 aircraft went chasing empty decks. The San Bernardino Strait, the gateway to Leyte Gulf, was left open. For that open door, Kurita paid in advance, and dearly. Before he had laid eyes on a single American ship, his fleet was already being killed. On the 23rd of October, in the Palawan Passage, 2 American submarines, the Darter and the Dace, lay in wait for his force, and in minutes sent 2 heavy cruisers to the bottom, including the flagship Otago, and crippled a third. Kurita ended up in the water. They fished him out and moved him to the Yamato, but 5 ships had already been struck from the count, and the battle had not even begun. The next day the aircraft came. In the Sibuyan Sea, American carrier planes went at his force all day, sortie after sortie, more than 250 times, hammering Kurita's ships. Their main target was the Musashi, the twin sister of the Yamato. The very ship they had designed to be unsinkable was sunk slowly and methodically, torpedo by torpedo, bomb by bomb, until she rolled over and went under, with nearly half her crew. Kurita watched one of the 2 greatest battleships in the world go down without ever firing her main guns at an enemy ship. Every one of those blows came from the sky. Not one came from an enemy battleship. A fleet built for a gunnery duel was dying, for the 2nd day running, from aircraft, without ever seeing the target it had been built to fight. And that lodged itself in the man on the bridge more deeply than any report. The sky is what kills. Carriers are the true threat. So, when the next morning, beyond the strait, foreign masts rose on the horizon, Kurita saw the thing he feared and the thing he sought at the same time. He looked at the water and saw the fear of the last 2 days. And he swung the enormous guns of the Yamato onto a target that, in his picture of the world, was deadly, and that in truth could barely answer. Remember the name of one man on the deck of that destroyer, because we will come back to him. His commander had carried a promise in his pocket for a year, spoken aloud in front of his whole crew, and this morning was the one day it could be kept. At 58 minutes past 6 in the morning, the Yamato opened fire. The range was monstrous even for her, more than 30 kilometers, past the edge of what naval gunnery can even do. And still, by only the 3rd salvo, a shell 46 centimeters across came down directly under the keel of the escort carrier White Plains, burst underwater, and shook the ship so hard it knocked out a boiler and cut her power for 3 minutes. That tiny carrier on a merchant hull took damage she never recovered from for the rest of the war. For the Americans on the flight decks, it looked like the end of the world. The first salvos came down around them in colored fountains, red, green, yellow, purple. The Japanese dyed the bursting charge of their shells in different colors so that each ship could pick out its own splashes in the water and correct its aim. The gunnery officer of the Johnston, Lieutenant Robert Hagen, caught red dye from a near miss full in the face. He wiped his eyes and remarked aloud that somebody, it seemed, was mad at them. Behind that grim joke stood the exact arithmetic of hopelessness. The gap in the numbers is the whole of the story that morning. The 9 guns of the Yamato measured 46 centimeters across. The largest gun in all of Taffy Three was 5 inches, about 13 centimeters. A shell from the Yamato weighed more than 1.5 tons. A shell from the Johnston weighed about 25 kilograms. A single main turret of the Yamato weighed more than the entire destroyer Johnston did, whole. The battleship could throw more steel in one salvo than an American destroyer carried aboard at all, in every magazine put together. The armor belt of the Yamato reached better than 40 centimeters at the waterline. The escort carriers of Taffy Three had no armor at all, a merchant hull, a steel shell wrapped around a hangar, and tanks full of aviation fuel. By any logic of a gunnery battle, this should have been over in a handful of minutes. It was not over. And the reason lay not in the steel, but in the head of the man on the bridge. From here begins the real story of Samar, and it is not about guns. It is about how a fleet that prided itself on precision forgot how to see in the space of one morning. The first thing to fail was the identification of the target itself. Kurita watched the enemy through the optical rangefinders of the Yamato, among the finest optics ever fitted to a warship, and he could not make out what stood before him. The escort carriers of Taffy Three belonged to the Casablanca type. They were built by the dozen in the yards of Henry Kaiser on hulls designed for merchant transports by the mass assembly methods of cargo shipbuilding. Warships born from a freighter's blueprint, and in the Japanese silhouette recognition tables, they simply were not there. Kurita searched with his eyes for what he saw and found no match. And since a small, unarmored carrier did not exist in his picture of a fleet, his mind built the missing thing up into what could be there, into an Essex-class strike carrier. From there, the error fed on itself. Koyanagi recalled afterward that the American destroyers came at them with many funnels and a high freeboard, and by their look alone and their manner of loosing torpedoes, the Japanese decided they were cruisers. Every sign was read one class higher. A destroyer became a cruiser. An escort carrier became a fleet carrier. The desperate torpedo attack of 7 small ships became the work of a powerful covering squadron. The thick smoke the Americans drew across the horizon, the Japanese took for the skilled maneuvering of a large formation. Even the speed deceived them. Someone on the Japanese side reported the carriers were making 30 knots, when the real limit of those hulls was around 18. An optical deception, born of smoke and rain squalls, settled over a deception of the mind. Put all of that together, and you get what happened inside Kurita's head. He did not count the ships one by one. He saw the overall shape of a threat, recognized in it the nightmare of the last 2 days, the enemy aircraft, the enemy carriers, the thing that had sunk the Musashi and built up the rest. Koyanagi put the enemy's strength at 4 or 5 fast carriers, battleships, and 10 heavy cruisers. The true tonnage of that American formation was overestimated by the Japanese staff by roughly 5 times over. And then Kurita made a second error, one that flowed straight out of the first. Certain that the enemy's main body stood before him, and that every minute brought the strike of enemy carrier planes closer, he did not reform his fleet into a single battle line. Such a line, 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers in formation, would have brought the whole weight of his guns down at once and almost certainly wiped Taffy Three away in half an hour. Instead, he gave the order for general attack, each division to act on its own, to chase and to sink however it could. His own chief of staff admitted afterward that neither formation nor coordination was kept. The most powerful gunnery fleet in the world, by the command of its own commander, scattered into lone hunters at the very moment its strength lay in staying together. And here is the question that hung over the bridge of the Yamato and will not let go of us until the end of this story. Why did the man who had everything in hand to win the battle in half an hour never give the order that would have won it? The answer hides in a single object. Not a ship, not a gun. A page that was not there. On the bridge of the Yamato lay the recognition tables, albums of enemy ship silhouettes by which the fleet worked out who it was dealing with. Every class of American ship known to Japanese intelligence was in them. The line of the hull, the number of funnels, the layout of the superstructure, the silhouette from the beam and from 3/4 on. An instrument of precision, the pride of staff work, a way to turn a vague smudge on the horizon into a name, a tonnage, and a set of weak points. The entire purpose of those albums was that one should never have to guess. What stood before Kurita was not in the albums. The Casablanca-type escort carrier had not made it into the imperial tables, because by the logic of the Japanese Navy, it should not have existed. Who builds a carrier out of a cargo hull? Who stamps out warships on an assembly line like tin cans by the dozen in civilian yards, just so there are enough flight decks to cover every minor landing on every nameless island? The Japanese Navy built few ships and built them perfect, summits of the engineering art, each one the work of years. The idea of churning out disposable carriers from freighters would not fit inside that head any more than it fit inside the recognition album. And so the empty page became the proof. Kurita found no silhouette of an escort carrier and built the missing thing up into an Essex. An absence of information turned into the presence of a threat. Behind that page missing from the album stood the whole of American war industry. Kaiser's Yards, launching an escort carrier in less than a week by the end of the war, a production line on which a warship was put together like an automobile. 50 carriers of the Casablanca type alone came down the slipways. Japanese intelligence could not keep pace cataloging them, not because it worked badly, but because American production outran the very ability to keep account. This was not the failure of one album. This was the failure of a whole way of thinking about war. If the mechanics of this miscalculation hold your attention the way they held it that morning on the bridge of the Yamato, subscribing to the channel means you will not miss the next story like it. The blindness had one more side to it, almost absurd, and it explains why the battle stretched to 3 hours instead of half an hour. When the Yamato finally took the Johnston in her sights, the very ship that had torpedoed the cruiser Kumano, she opened fire with her main guns. Armor-piercing shells. These shells were made for one task: to punch through the 40-centimeter armor of an enemy battleship, drive deep into the hull, and burst there. Their fuse was set to trigger on the shock of striking thick steel. The Johnston had no thick steel. She had no armor at all. And so, shells weighing 1.5 tons, when they struck the destroyer, passed clean through her thin hull, in one side and out the other, without meeting resistance enough to set off the fuse. A weapon designed to kill battleships turned out to be nearly harmless against a ship with nothing to punch through. Later, when the Johnston was already doomed, her crew was saved further by the fact that her fuel bunkers had been drawn down nearly to the bottom, with no oil left for the catastrophic fire that usually finishes a ship from the inside. Here lies the paradox of the whole morning, folded into a single detail. A fleet had honed its main weapon to absolute perfection for a battle that no longer existed. The largest gun in history met an enemy for whom its shell was simply too good. It had been made to kill titans. And what it had to kill was tin. And for tin, it would not do. Kurita still thought he was sinking the carriers of the Third Fleet. In truth, his fleet spent 3 hours unable to deal with a handful of ships it should, by every calculation, have swept away in minutes. While on the bridge of the Yamato, 4 battleships and 6 cruisers chased the ghost of the Third Fleet. On the other side of that ghost, real men lived and died. The first to come out of the American smoke was the Johnston. Her commander, Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans, did not wait for an order. He swung the destroyer bow on toward the Japanese column, brought her to full speed, and drove in alone against a line of heavy cruisers, laying smoke behind him to hide the carriers at his back. On the bridge of the Yamato, this was read exactly as a blinded system was bound to read it. A covering cruiser was coming at them. The battleships Nagato and Haruna shifted their main guns onto the small ship, and the Yamato fired 19 shells of her secondary battery at her. All of it went wide, sometimes barely. The Johnston closed to about 10 kilometers of the lead cruiser Kumano, fired her 5-inch guns, more than 200 rounds in 5 minutes, set the cruiser's superstructure ablaze, and loosed all 10 of her torpedoes. At least one struck the Kumano in the bow and tore it away. The heavy cruiser fell out of the fight, and a second cruiser turned aside to escort the cripple. One American destroyer had just taken 2 heavy cruisers off the board under her own power without being hit once. The reckoning came within minutes. The Yamato had been tracking the cruiser that torpedoed the Kumano and put a full salvo into the Johnston. 3 armor-piercing shells 46 centimeters across struck her aft below the waterline, cut her speed to 17 knots, and killed power to her after guns. Right behind them, 3 secondary battery shells slammed into the bridge. Evans lost 2 fingers from his left hand and the shirt off his back, and the dead and the dying lay all around him. He refused morphine and ordered the corpsman to see to the crew and not to him. And he took the broken ship back into the fight. When Evans saw the escort carrier Gambier Bay burning under the guns of a Japanese cruiser, he gave the order his gunnery officer called the most courageous he ever heard: to open fire on that cruiser, to draw her fire onto themselves and away from the carrier. His steering control gone, Evans moved his command to the fantail, and shouted rudder orders down through an open hatch, while below him, sailors turned the wheel by hand. Like that, blind and without power, the Johnston fought on for more than 2 hours. She was not alone. The destroyer Hoel drove straight at the battleship Congo, loosed her torpedoes from 9 kilometers, and was shot to pieces at close range, boxed in by Japanese battleships and cruisers firing at her from every side. The Hoel held on until more than 40 shells had been put into her and went under, taking most of her crew with her. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, a ship half the size of a destroyer, went in on a torpedo attack alongside her larger brothers. Her commander, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, told his crew over the loudspeaker that this was a fight against overwhelming odds, from which survival was not to be expected, and that they would do what damage they could. Overhead, the pilots of Taffy Three came at the Japanese ships again and again, and when the bombs and torpedoes were gone, they made dummy runs, empty passes, only to force a battleship to turn away. The point of all of it was one thing: to make the huge ships dodge, to spoil their aim, to steal their minutes. Every stolen minute was a little more distance for the slow carriers towards safety. Not everyone bought those minutes for themselves. The escort carrier Gambier Bay, at the rear of the American formation, fell behind and came under the direct fire of the heavy ships. An unarmored hull could not hold the shells that were going into her. They shot her up methodically until she lost way, heeled over, and rolled. The Gambier Bay became the only American carrier of the entire war sunk by the guns of surface ships. Everything the destroyers were fighting for stood on an edge just that thin. A minute's delay in the smoke, one cruiser not driven off, and an unarmed flight deck went to the bottom with its people. By the 10th hour of the morning, the Johnston was a ship in name only. Japanese destroyers ringed her and took her apart piece by piece. They brought down her mast, killed her last working engine, wrecked the bridge, set her afire down her whole length. Where a Yamato shell had gone into her at the start of the battle, the hull began to come apart. Evans moved his command to the very stern. At 45 minutes past 9, he gave the order to abandon ship. At 10 minutes past 10, the Johnston rolled over and sank. And here happened the thing that does not fit the logic of a battle. A Japanese destroyer passing by, the Yukikaze, did not finish off the men in the water. Her commander, Terauchi Masamichi, brought his crew up on deck, and the Japanese sailors saluted the dying American ship and her men in the sea. Some of the survivors would say afterward that they saw Evans alive in a lifeboat, returning the salute. Of the 327 men in the Johnston's crew, 186 died. Some were killed in the fighting, some died on the rafts from their wounds, and 92 men, the commander among them, were alive in the water after the ship went down and were never heard from again. Rescue ships did not arrive for 50 hours. Evans was not among the saved. His body was never found. And on the bridge of the Yamato, the man for fear of whom all of this was done was making the last decision of that morning. Kurita had been on the bridge almost 2 full days without sleep. In 3 days, one flagship had sunk beneath him, and the twin sister of his own ship had gone down. He was still certain he was fighting the main body of the Third Fleet, and he was intercepting radio messages from which a frightening picture came together. American carriers gathering somewhere nearby, Halsey turning back toward him, heavy ships of the Seventh Fleet closing in. The desperate attacks of small ships he took for cruisers had, for 3 hours, kept him from closing his formation and seeing who he was actually fighting. His own cruisers were dying under attack from the air. 3 heavy cruisers the force lost that morning. And at 9:15, Kurita gave the order that entered history as one of the great riddles of the war. He turned his fleet north and broke off the battle. Later, he wavered again, turned back toward the Gulf again. But in the end, he took the force away, never reaching the Leyte beachhead for which he had lost so many ships and men. He was certain he was pulling out of a closing trap set by the strongest fleet in the world. In fact, he had turned around within 3 hours steaming of nearly defenseless troop transports and sailed away from a victory he held in his hands but could not make himself see. Later, after the war, he would admit himself that the decision to turn back had been a mistake. The cost of that morning to Taffy Three was heavy. 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort were lost, and more than 1,000 Americans did not come home. Losses on the scale of the men and ships lost at the Coral Sea and Midway put together. But a handful of landing support ships had turned back a fleet that, by any calculation, should have gone through them like paper. Admiral Chester Nimitz would later write that the survival of Taffy Three was nothing short of special dispensation from the Almighty. And the most precise account of what happened was not left by him. The victory of the small American formation grew from a single fact. The enemy did not believe how weak the target standing before him really was. Let us come back to the man with whom this morning began. Ernest Edwin Evans was born in 1908 in Pawnee, Oklahoma, into a family with Cherokee and Creek roots. He rose from an ordinary enlisted sailor to command of a destroyer by way of the Naval Academy. On the day the Johnston was commissioned, in October of 1943, Evans stood before his crew and spoke the words that turned out to be a promise. This was going to be a fighting ship. He intended to go in harm's way, and anyone who did not want to go along had better get off now. A year later, almost to the day, he kept that promise. The Johnston was 3 days short of her first birthday. For long decades, the Johnston and her commander lived only in the accounts of the survivors and in the text of a citation. Evans was awarded the Medal of Honor after his death, the nation's highest military decoration. But the man himself was never found. Not in 1944, and not after. The ship was found. In the year 2021, 77 years on, a deep-sea expedition located the wreck of the Johnston on the bottom off Samar, at a depth of about 6.5 kilometers. It turned out to be the deepest shipwreck any human had reached up to that point, deeper than any other sunken ship in the world. The hull number 557 could still be read on her plating, after decades under the weight of the water. The man who had promised to go in harm's way, and kept his word to the end, came to rest deeper than anyone they were looking for. And when the research vessel finished its work over the wreck, it came to a stop, sounded its whistle, and laid a wreath on the water. That morning off the island of Samar, 2 fleets met, and each was wrong in the exact opposite way. The weaker one went forward because it did not count the odds. The stronger one turned back because it counted them too well and got the count wrong anyway. The largest gun in history lost a battle to a ship that was too small for it to kill. If this story was worth your time, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so these ships and their people stay in view instead of sinking out of sight along with their names. There are more stories like this one still ahead.